In the early years of the 20th century, Canada was a young dominion under the British Crown, still defining its national identity and global role. When war erupted in Europe in the year 1914, Canada was automatically drawn into the conflict as part of the British Empire. But what began as a distant European affair soon became a crucible that would forge a new sense of Canadian nationhood and sacrifice. The outbreak of the First World War saw an overwhelming wave of patriotic enthusiasm across Canada. Volunteers flocked to enlist in what they believed would be a short and glorious adventure. The Canadian Expeditionary Force was assembled and trained before being sent to the trenches of France and Belgium, where the true horrors of modern warfare would challenge their spirit and resolve. One of the earliest moments that cemented Canada's military legacy came at the Battle of Ypres in 1915, where Canadian soldiers faced the first large-scale use of poison gas. Despite being overwhelmed and outnumbered, they held the line and earned the respect of Allied commanders. But it was the Battle of Vimy Ridge in April 1917 that would become Canada's national coming-of-age. Vimy Ridge was a heavily fortified German position considered nearly impenetrable by both French and British forces. Previous attempts to capture the ridge had failed at tremendous cost. Yet under the leadership of General Arthur Currie, Canadian forces meticulously planned a coordinated assault using new tactics such as the creeping barrage and thorough rehearsals. On Easter Monday, the Canadians advanced with precision and tenacity, braving machine gun fire and barbed wire to claim the ridge in a stunning victory. This triumph came at a heavy price with over 10,000 Canadian casualties. But the success at Vimy marked the first time all 4 Canadian divisions had fought together, and it symbolized the emergence of Canada as a nation independent in thought and action. After Vimy, Canada's military stature grew, and its soldiers became known for their effectiveness and bravery in battles such as Passchendaele and the 100 Days Offensive. These contributions were not limited to the battlefield. Back home, the war effort spurred industrial production and social change. Canadian women played critical roles in factories and hospitals, pushing forward the movement for women's suffrage, which eventually led to limited voting rights by the end of the war. Though the war ended in 1918, the scars ran deep. Nearly 60,000 Canadians lost their lives, and countless more returned home, physically and emotionally shattered. Yet their sacrifice had helped win the war and brought Canada a seat at the table in the post-war negotiations, including the Treaty of Versailles, where for the first time Canada signed as a separate nation. The First World War had redefined Canada's place in the world, transforming it from a colony into an emerging nation, with its own voice and identity. The bloodshed at Vimy had not been in vain, for it laid the foundation for Canada's evolving role in international affairs and military leadership, which would once again be tested 2 decades later when the world plunged into an even greater conflict. As the world spiraled once again into chaos with the outbreak of the Second World War. In 1939, Canada did not hesitate to answer the call. This time, however, Canada declared war on its own terms a full week after Britain, marking a significant milestone in its evolution as an independent nation. Though still part of the British Commonwealth, Canada was no longer bound to enter war automatically, and its sovereign decision to stand with the Allies symbolized both loyalty and autonomy. Under the leadership of Prime Minister William Lyon, Mackenzie King Canada began to mobilize its military industry and manpower with an efficiency that reflected lessons learned from the Great War. The country was determined to play a more strategic role, not only on the battlefield, but also on the economic and diplomatic fronts. Over the course of the war, more than 1 million Canadians served in the armed forces, a staggering number for a population of just 11 million. This level of commitment would place Canada among the principal contributors to the Allied war effort. Canadian soldiers, sailors, and airmen would see combat in every major theater. From the skies over Britain to the deserts of North Africa to the beaches of France and the frozen seas of the North Atlantic. One of Canada's earliest and most tragic engagements in the Second World War was the Dieppe Raid in 1940. This operation was intended to test German defenses along the French coast and provide valuable intelligence for future invasions. However, it became a bloodbath. Over 5,000 Canadians participated in the raid, and nearly 60% were killed, wounded, or captured. The operation failed to achieve most of its objectives and remains one of the darkest chapters in Canadian military history. Yet it provided crucial lessons in amphibious warfare that would later contribute to the success of the D-Day invasion. Canada's commitment to the air war was equally significant. Through the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, Canada became a vast training ground for Allied pilots and aircrew. Over 130,000 men were trained on Canadian soil, a remarkable achievement that earned the country the nickname the Aerodrome of Democracy. In the skies above Europe, Canadian squadrons flew dangerous bombing missions and supported ground operations with skill and courage. The Royal Canadian Navy, too, underwent a massive transformation. At the outset of the war, Canada's Navy was small and ill-equipped, but by the end of the conflict, it had grown to become the third-largest Allied naval force Canadian. Ships played a vital role in escorting convoys across the treacherous North Atlantic, a lifeline for Britain that was constantly under threat from German U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic was a grueling test of endurance and determination, and Canadian sailors often faced extreme conditions with little recognition, but their contributions were essential in maintaining the flow of troops, weapons, and supplies. Canada's domestic front was marked by a massive mobilization of industry agriculture, and labor women stepped into roles previously reserved for men working in munitions factories, shipyards, and civil service. Their participation not only kept the war effort alive, but also challenged traditional gender norms, leading to lasting changes. In Canadian society, the war also reignited complex debates over conscription. As casualties mounted overseas, pressure grew to send more reinforcements. The issue deeply divided the nation, particularly between English and French Canadians, who had conflicting views about the country's involvement in what many in Quebec saw as a British war. Despite Mackenzie King's promise to avoid conscription, a national plebiscite in 1942 led to its eventual implementation, though on a limited scale. This decision stirred political tensions and left scars that would linger in Canadian politics for years to come. Meanwhile, Canadian scientists, engineers, and industrialists contributed to the Allied technological edge, from radar development to the secretive Manhattan Project. Canada's intellectual and natural resources became increasingly vital to the war effort. The country supplied uranium hydroelectric power and other materials while also producing tanks, aircraft, and ships at unprecedented rates. Canada's wartime economy boomed, laying the groundwork for post-war prosperity. As Allied forces prepared for the liberation of Europe, Canadian soldiers were assigned a prominent role in Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history. On June 6, 1944, Canadian troops landed at Juno Beach, one of 5 designated invasion sectors along the Normandy coast. Their objective was to advance inland, secure strategic points, and link up with British and American forces. The landing at Juno was fierce. German defenses were heavily fortified, and machine gun nests wreaked havoc on the incoming troops. Yet the Canadians pushed forward, demonstrating remarkable bravery and discipline. By the end of the day, they had advanced farther inland than any other Allied unit, capturing key objectives and proving their mettle once again. The success at Juno Beach was not merely a tactical victory, but a symbolic one, reinforcing Canada's reputation as a capable and courageous fighting force. In the weeks that followed, Canadian forces continued to fight through the hedgerows and villages of Normandy, engaging in brutal close-quarter combat, the Battle of Caen, and the subsequent advance through the Falaise Gap were marked by high casualties and intense resistance, but Canadian units played a crucial role in breaking the German defensive lines and opening the path for the liberation of Paris and ultimately Western Europe. As the war progressed, Canada's military continued its push across France into Belgium and the Netherlands, facing entrenched German forces and navigating flooded landscapes and urban ruins. The campaign to liberate the Netherlands was particularly grueling, yet deeply meaningful. The Dutch people still remember the Canadian soldiers who brought them freedom and relief during the harsh winter of 1944 to 45 when food and resources were scarce. Canadian troops not only fought but also provided humanitarian aid, earning lifelong gratitude and cementing a bond between the two nations that endures to this day. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Canada had firmly established itself as a middle power with global reach and credibility. Its contributions in manpower production strategy and sacrifice were acknowledged by its allies and appreciated by the liberated nations. Canada's role in the Second World War marked its full transformation from colony to sovereign nation, a partner in shaping the modern world and defending its values. The legacy of Canadian involvement from the beaches of Dieppe to the streets of Amsterdam was one of courage, integrity, and commitment to freedom, laying the foundation for its future role in peacekeeping, diplomacy, and international leadership. As Europe breathed a fragile sigh of relief following the collapse of Nazi Germany in May 1945, the world quickly turned its eyes to the Pacific theater, where the war raged on against Japan. Though Canada's military presence in the Pacific was smaller than in Europe, the nation still contributed through the Royal Canadian Navy and Royal Canadian Air Force, assisting in operations in the Aleutian Islands and escorting convoys across the Pacific Ocean. More significantly, Canadian factories continued to supply war materials and logistical support for the Allied effort against Japan. The sudden and devastating use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought an abrupt end to the war. After 6 years of global bloodshed, the Second World War was over, and Canada once again found itself transformed by the fires of war. The cost was staggering, with over 45,000 Canadians dead and tens of thousands more wounded both physically and emotionally. Veterans returned home to a changed country, one that had experienced rapid industrial growth, social shifts, and the beginning of its emergence on the world stage. The contributions of Indigenous soldiers who served valiantly in both wars began to be recognized despite the discrimination they faced both before and after their service. The experience of war had also deeply affected the Canadian home front, pushing forward conversations about civil rights, immigration, and the role of government in providing for its citizens. After the war, Canada swiftly transitioned from a wartime economy to one focused on reconstruction and peace. The government introduced policies to support returning veterans, including access to education loans for housing and support for small businesses. These initiatives helped create a strong middle class and positioned Canada as one of the most stable democracies in the post-war world. Canada's global reputation had shifted dramatically. Before the wars, Canada was often seen as a colonial appendage of the British Empire, but by the end of the Second World War, it had emerged as an independent player with a voice in shaping the new world. Order Canada was a founding member of the United Nations and took part in crafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In subsequent years, it would also play a leading role in the formation of NATO and the early development of global peacekeeping missions. Perhaps most notably, the shared experience of war brought English and French Canadians together in a common cause. Despite the internal divisions over conscription and language, the heroism displayed by soldiers from all parts of Canada began to bridge long-standing cultural and political gaps. French-Canadian units had fought bravely and earned the same honors and hardships as their English counterparts, paving the way for a more unified national identity. Yet the wars had also left their share of unresolved tensions, particularly with Indigenous communities who had contributed to the war effort only to return to continued marginalization and broken promises. The struggles of Black Canadians and other racial minorities, who had served with distinction yet faced systemic racism at home, also remained a stain on the country's conscience. In the decades following the Second World War, Canada would begin a slow but determined path toward addressing these injustices. By the 1960s, the country had adopted a more multicultural and inclusive approach to citizenship, dismantling racially based immigration policies and beginning formal reconciliation efforts with Indigenous peoples. the legacy of the world. Wars remained central to Canada's sense of identity. Throughout the country, monuments and memorials were erected in cities, towns, and villages, large and small, honoring the names of the fallen and reminding future generations of the cost of freedom. The national remembrance ceremonies held each year on November 11th became a solemn tradition, with citizens wearing red poppies and observing a moment of silence to reflect on the sacrifices made. Canada's military continued to evolve in the post-war years, transitioning from a combat force to a peacekeeping one. During the Cold War, Canadian forces were stationed in Europe as part of NATO and participated in peacekeeping missions in places like Cyprus, the Congo, and later the Balkans. These operations built on Canada's wartime legacy of international engagement and demonstrated the country's commitment to maintaining global stability. In many ways, the transformation of Canada's global role from the First World War to the end of the Second was profound and irreversible. The country had gone from a colony that followed Britain's lead to a sovereign power that could act independently and shape the world around it. Canada's involvement at Vimy Ridge had been a spark, but it was the sustained contributions across 2 world wars that forged the modern Canadian identity. Strong, resilient, bilingual, inclusive, and globally minded, Canada's story from Vimy to Normandy was not just one of battlefields and borders, but of a people coming into their own through hardship, sacrifice, and the pursuit of peace. The wars had taken their toll, but they had also gifted Canada a legacy of valor, a spirit of unity, and a duty to remember, for every soldier who never returned. And for every community forever changed, the memory of what was fought for continued to shape the Canada of tomorrow. The cemeteries in France, the poppies in November, the names etched in granite, and the stories passed down through families, all spoke to a nation that had stood when it mattered and had helped bend the arc of history toward justice and freedom. The echoes of Vimy and the legacy of Normandy lived on, not in the glory of war, but in the peace that followed, in the values that were defended, and in the quiet strength of a country that had come of age on the world's bloodiest stage. In the post-war world, Canada's role on the international stage continued to evolve, drawing directly from its experiences and reputation, forged in the world wars. The nation's participation in the formation of the United Nations and its advocacy for collective security and peacekeeping set it apart as a country committed not just to warfighting, but to global peace. The shadow of Vimy Ridge and the triumph at Normandy became more than military victories. They were foundational elements of Canada's emerging identity as a global peacekeeper and moral voice. Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson himself, a veteran of wartime diplomacy, would later earn the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in resolving the Suez Canal crisis in 1956 by proposing the first large-scale United Nations peacekeeping force. This approach to international conflict resolution deeply reflected Canada's desire to never again witness the kind of global devastation that had defined the first half of the century. Pearson's philosophy and Canada's readiness to contribute troops to peacekeeping missions were seen as a modern extension of the courage displayed on the battlefield, but now expressed through diplomacy, negotiation, and humanitarian intervention. Yet this new chapter was only possible because of the credibility earned in war. The world respected Canada not only because of its diplomatic finesse, but because of the enormous sacrifices it had made and the consistent valor its soldiers had shown in 2 of the most brutal conflicts in human history. This credibility allowed Canada to take leadership roles in NATO, the G7, and other international organizations where its balanced voice and moderate stance were often welcomed in polarizing global debates. Back home, the memory of the wars continued to shape national consciousness. War veterans became community leaders, their stories a vital part of public memory. Schools taught the history of Vimy Ridge, Dieppe, and Normandy, not as distant events, but as essential chapters in the story of what it meant to be Canadian. Monuments like the Canadian National Vimy Memorial in France and the Juno Beach Center in Normandy became pilgrimage sites for Canadians seeking to understand the cost of their freedom. Families who had lost sons, daughters, fathers, and mothers to both world wars kept their memories alive through personal artifacts, letters, and oral histories. These collective memories were reinforced each year on Remembrance Day, when Canadians paused in unity to acknowledge the fallen and express gratitude, not just for peace, but for the responsibility that came with preserving it. The red poppy symbol, adopted from the famous poem In Flanders Fields, became more than an emblem of mourning. It was a declaration of values of honor, sacrifice, and national unity. During the Cold War era, Canada maintained a delicate balance between aligning with its Western allies and preserving its independence in foreign policy. This position often stemmed from its wartime experiences, which had taught the dangers of blind allegiance, and the value of standing firm on principle. Canadian troops participated in NATO operations and were stationed in Europe, but the country also resisted joining certain initiatives like the Vietnam War, choosing instead to focus on humanitarian aid and conflict mediation. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, the legacy of Canada's wartime experience influenced its immigration policies, multicultural framework, and stance on global development. Veterans returning from both wars had seen the world and brought back broader perspectives that challenged the insular nature of early Canadian society. The wars had also exposed the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom abroad while denying basic rights to Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians, and other marginalized communities. A slow but determined push for civil rights reforms began to take hold. Inspired in part by the contradictions revealed during wartime, the federal government began to implement policies that would shape the modern Canadian mosaic, including the Multiculturalism Act of 1971, which formally recognized the cultural diversity of its citizens and sought to preserve and promote it. This shift in national identity would not have been possible without the shared sacrifice and unity born in the trenches of France and the fields of Flanders. The story of Vimy to Normandy was not just about Canada's military prowess. It was about how a nation under the dominion of another, transformed through suffering and service into an independent force for good on the world stage. The values tested in war, perseverance, fairness, collective effort, and courage, became the values aspired to in peace. When Canadian soldiers landed at Juno Beach, they were not just liberators, they were symbols of a country willing to stand up for justice, regardless of its size or past. They represented the idea that courage was not exclusive to empires and superpowers, but could come from a young country still finding its voice. Canada's involvement in the world wars created a legacy that continued to shape its defense policy, diplomacy, education, and sense of national unity. In popular culture, books, films, and documentaries about Canadian soldiers became tools to educate younger generations, not to glorify war, but to understand its cost and honor its lessons. Museums, archives, and historical societies flourished, preserving the memory of those who fought and died, so that their sacrifices would not be forgotten. The Royal Canadian Legion remained an influential institution in communities across the country, advocating for veterans and promoting the remembrance of Canadian military history. Even the country's involvement in Afghanistan and peacekeeping missions in the 21st century were often viewed through the lens of its past when it proved itself at Vimy and Normandy. These modern military actions, though different in scope and purpose, carried echoes of a legacy rooted in courage, resilience, and a deep belief in human dignity. As generations changed and the number of surviving veterans dwindled, the importance of remembrance grew ever more vital. Schools held assemblies where children recited poetry and laid wreaths at local cenotaphs. Public figures attended solemn ceremonies, and digital archives made it possible for Canadians from all walks of life to connect with the wartime experiences of their ancestors. The story of Canada's role in the world wars had become part of the national soul, not simply as history, but as identity. It was a reminder of what the country stood for, what it had endured, and what it had contributed to the world in its darkest hours. The spirit of Those who had marched through mud-faced machine guns, braved freezing waters, and freed towns they had never heard of lived on, not in grandeur, but in the quiet conviction that peace was worth the price, and that Canada would always rise to defend. The legacy of Canada's role in the World Wars, from the storming of Vimy Ridge to the valor at Juno Beach, endures not as a tale of conquest, but as a testament to character and conviction. It is the story of a nation that came of age not through imperial ambition, but through sacrifice, resilience, and a quiet strength that resonated far beyond its borders. In both wars, Canadian soldiers marched not to dominate, but to defend the principles of freedom and justice, their courage under fire. Their unity in diversity, and their unwavering determination, became the bedrock of a national identity forged not in palaces or parliaments, but in muddy trenches, bombed-out towns, and distant shores. Canada emerged from the 20th century not just with military honors, but with moral authority as a nation willing to bear burdens for the sake of a better world. The battles may have ended, but the spirit of those who fought continued to guide Canadian values, policies, and international posture. Through peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, and unwavering support for democratic institutions, Canada carried forward the torch lit at Vimy and kept alive on the beaches of Normandy, from the shattered fields of Flanders to the liberated towns of the Netherlands. From the Atlantic crossings to the training skies above prairie airfields, every step was a building block of a sovereign, compassionate, and courageous Canada. The war memorials and Remembrance Day ceremonies are not just rituals. They are vows etched into the collective conscience to never forget and to always uphold the legacy of those who gave everything. For every name on a cenotaph, for every poppy pinned close to the heart, for every lesson passed from one generation to the next, the message is clear. Canada stood and will always stand for peace, justice, and humanity. Its journey through the crucibles of the world wars transformed it into a nation not only respected for its bravery, but revered for its values. The echoes of Vimy and the legacy of Normandy are not only found in history books, they live in the heartbeat of a country forever changed and forever proud.